with Just Stop Oil. And the reason we're talking about them today is because the co-founder, Roger Hallam, is very much in the news. He's been jailed for 5 years, and 4 other activists have been jailed for 4 years over plots to block the M25 that, of course, saw over 50,000 hours of vehicle delay. These were incidents that took place in November 2022. Now, important to stress that Mr. Hallam did not actually block anything himself. He was merely in the planning, or was merely on a Zoom call that the Sun infiltrated, and therefore has met his punishments today with 5 years in jail. I'm no fan of Just Stop Oil whatsoever. I think what they did with Stonehenge just a few months ago was completely pointless, completely crass. I don't think it made the blindest bit of difference. I don't really know who it upset other than people who were celebrating the solstice. I also deplored when they blocked motorways and all of these linked groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil in this case. But I do think reading 5 years in jail, that slightly sticks in the craw for me. And I do wonder if that is slightly too harsh. As I say, no fan of Just Stop Oil at all. I think their tactics are wrong. I've said that before. I think many people believe that their tactics are wrong. Clearly, others believe it's right. You heard Chris Packham a few minutes ago, who's very much in support. But 5 years for a man who co-founded the group, who conspired to organise those protests that caused huge disruption on the M25 back in 2022. Do you think that's too harsh? I mean, 5 years in prison, that would be the longest non-violent protest prison sentence that we've seen in this country. I wonder, do you think that's right? Do you think actually he reaped what he sowed? You have no sympathy for him whatsoever? Or maybe you feel slightly uncomfortable about it like me? 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can WhatsApp on that same number, text 84850, or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. He was on a sort of Zoom Teams call, Roger Hallam, when plotting this just a few days before it actually happened. Now, remember what happened back in November 2022? We saw 45 people climb up gantries. The estimated economic cost was $765,000, while it cost the Met Police more than £1.1 million. Some of the stats also suggest it caused more than 50,000 hours of vehicle delays. It affected 700,000 vehicles and left the M25 compromised for more than 120 hours. Clearly, I think a lot of people would suggest that those tactics were utterly wrong, deplorable. I'm in favour of people meeting their punishment for organising those attacks and, attacked those incidents, and actually those, the people who were involved in organising it, as well as the people who climbed the gantries. But 5 years for a man who wasn't actually scaling the M25 or any of the gantries seems to me slightly unfair. Well, let's speak now to Francesca Cociani, who's Senior Associate at Hodge, Jones and Allen, specialising in criminal defence and protest and representing one of the defendants during the sentencing of this trial. Francesca, thank you very much for joining us. I just wondered, first of all, were you surprised, as I was, at the length of these sentences?
Good evening, Harry. Yes, indeed, we were all surprised at the length of the sentences. Today, we have seen the longest prison sentence for peaceful protest in UK history and, in fact, Europe. There is no European authority, so no case law or precedent from the court in Strasbourg where a peaceful protester has been sentenced to more than a handful of days in custody. So, indeed, the sentence was rather surprising today.
But do you accept that for plotting such a protest, there should have been some form of punishment, some form of prison sentence?
Indeed, they were charged with criminal offences. They went through the criminal justice system. Ultimately, a jury found him guilty, and therefore, they were all due to be sentenced today by a judge. But it's not to say that an immediate custodial sentence was inevitable, and it's not to say that a lengthy sentence, such as those we've seen 4 and 5 years, was necessarily proportionate or justified.
I see that Chris Packham, who's of course the TV presenter, and other campaigners in this field are saying it sets a worrying precedent, not just in terms of environmental action, but also in terms of other peaceful protest. I wonder if you agree with that.
Well, yes, and in fact, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders has also expressed concern today, stating that the sentence should shock the conscience of any members of the public. And he went on to say that it should put us on high alert on the state of civic rights and freedoms in the UK.
Many of LBC listeners this evening, Francesca, will be frustrated, though, because they will feel that, look, they knew, the organisers, that there would be some form of punishment. You described it as a peaceful protest, and of course, inherently it is. But it's also incredibly inconvenient and also upset a lot of people, many of whom may have been driving for crucial engagements, many of whom were trying to get from A to B just to go about their daily lives. And for some reason, a group of 50 or so people felt it was appropriate to take it into their own hands and to effectively ruin their journeys.
And there is absolutely no doubt that this is a protest that caused a lot of disruption and a lot of inconvenience and several losses to many people. But when one looks at these sentences, they have to be put within the context of sentencing in this country for other offences, including other general crime offences like assaults, sexual assaults, domestic violence, etc. And for instance, when one looks at 4 and 5 years in custody, those are often at the very end of the spectrum of seriousness when it comes to an assault causing actual bodily harm to another person or a sexual assault. Whereas ultimately what we have before us is a very disruptive protest, but a peaceful protest nonetheless.
Now, I appreciate you're not a spokesperson for Just Stop Oil or anything like that, but I do wonder, with harsh sentences like this, do you feel that has any deterrent effect on these sorts of instances happening again, I wonder? Does the fact that Roger Hallam has got 5 years behind bars actually deter people from doing these kind of disruptive protests, do you imagine?
I think there's a risk that it will achieve the exact opposite effect of deterrence. There's a risk it would instigate outrage. It highlights the detachment between those who have authority and those who don't, and for whom the only means are civil disobedience, such as in this case. And it risks pushing people to protesting in more overt ways. And ultimately, these protesters, it's their motivations and views. They're not simply going to go away. Their concern for the climate crisis is not going to be fixed by a lengthy prison sentence.
And just lastly, Francesca, I wonder, with the legislation, a lot was made by not just groups like Just Stop Oil, but other groups, indeed free speech organisations, that were protesting some of the legislation on protest that was brought in under the Conservative government. Do you feel that legislation has had adverse consequences such as this?
Well, I think that legislation was brought in within a climate that is hostile towards protesters, including peaceful protesters. And it's that climate that no doubt has contributed to the sentences that we've seen today.